The smell of burning rubber hit me first, thick and acrid, curling into the morning air like a warning. Then came the heat, a blistering wave rolling off the flames consuming my father's 1986 Ford F-150, the fire crackling as 30 years of memories turned to ash in my own driveway. My breath caught in my throat as I stood frozen, the roar of the fire drowning out everything else. But then her voice cut through the chaos, sharp and triumphant. "This is what happens when you think you're above the rules, Mr. Carter." I turned, eyes locking onto Cynthia Blackwell, the queen of the Pine Crest HOA, standing on my lawn in her pristine blue suit like she was presiding over some kind of sick victory parade. Her arms were crossed, clipboard tucked under one arm, that smug smile twisting her lips as if she had just taught a wayward child a valuable lesson. Behind her, two men in AquaGuard environmental hazmat suits stood silently, one still gripping a gasoline canister, the other holding a high-end camera, recording the whole damn thing. I felt my pulse hammering against my ribs. "You set fire to my truck," I said, my voice low, steady, almost not my own. Cynthia barely blinked. "We neutralized an environmental hazard," she corrected. "Your illegal fuel operation posed a risk to the community water supply. The board authorized immediate action under Emergency Bylaw 8.3. My hands curled into fists. Biodiesel. My father's truck wasn't just some old junker rusting away in my driveway, it was a project we'd worked on together for years, converting it to run cleanly, efficiently, without harming the very water supply Cynthia claimed to be protecting. The real contamination? The golf courses and pools sucking the aquifer dry so that the estate section's million-dollar homes could keep their lawns unnaturally green through the worst drought this county had seen in decades. A loud pop shattered the morning stillness. A tire burst from the heat, sending a piece of rubber flying across the pavement. Neighbors were gathering now, standing in clusters in their pajamas, some recording on their phones, others whispering to each other. I saw Maggie Lawson across the street, her gray hair pulled back in a loose braid, a garden hose in her hands, but she didn't move. She knew it was useless. Cynthia, on the other hand, took a step forward, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "This is what happens when you ignore HOA regulations," she announced, her tone thick with self-righteousness. "We all have to make sacrifices for the good of the community." A biodiesel container exploded, sending glass and metal fragments into the air. The two men who had started the fire flinched, backing away toward an unmarked van, clearly beginning to realize they had crossed a dangerous line. But Cynthia? She didn't flinch. She didn't waver. If anything, she seemed emboldened by the destruction in front of her. And then, something changed. A shift. A moment of perfect clarity in the chaos. I straightened, took a step forward until I was staring her down across the burning wreckage of my father's truck. "Cynthia Elizabeth Blackwell," I said, my voice cutting clean through the smoke-filled air, "did you personally authorize these men to commit arson on my property?" She blinked, just for a fraction of a second. The first crack in her armor. "This was an enforcement action," she started, her bravado slipping just slightly. "The board. Yes or no, Cynthia?" I took another step forward, firelight reflecting off the gold mayoral badge I pulled from my pocket. The breath hitched in her throat. The color drained from her face. And in that moment, as the flames burned hotter and sirens howled in the distance, Cynthia Blackwell finally realized exactly who she had just screwed over. The silence that followed my revelation lasted only a breath, but it was enough. Enough for the gathered neighbors to shift uneasily, for the two men in hazmat suits to glance at each other like rats realizing they just boarded a sinking ship. But Cynthia? She squared her shoulders, desperate to regain control of the moment. "This changes nothing," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual edge. "Mayor or not, you still violated HOA environmental policies, and we were fully within our rights to enforce corrective action. This community has standards, and you." I let her keep talking, but I wasn't listening. Because this wasn't about today. This was about 7 years of her tightening the leash around this neighborhood's throat, and now, finally, the leash was snapping. Pine Crest Gardens had once been a place where middle-class families could afford a home with a yard, a place where people waved at their neighbors and borrowed sugar when they ran out. That changed the moment the developers came in, carving up the land to build the estates at Pine Crest, a luxury community that tripled home values overnight. What once had been a quiet town with modest homes became a playground for the wealthy, and those of us who had lived here long before the estate section existed suddenly found ourselves labeled as the undesirable past. Cynthia Blackwell arrived like a queen taking her throne. She was a former corporate attorney from Chicago, a woman who had spent her career litigating contract disputes so viciously that judges had been known to comment on her aggressive interpretation of the law. When she formed the Pine Crest Homeowners Association, she ruled it like a corporate dictatorship, instituting a 78-page rulebook that dictated everything from what color your front door could be to which day you had to remove Christmas decorations. And most people complied. It was easier than fighting, easier than dealing with the endless fines she doled out like candy at a parade. But I didn't comply. I kept my father's truck in the driveway, refusing to hide it away like it was something to be ashamed of. That truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was a piece of history, a piece of my father. We had spent years working on it together, and when he passed away, I swore I'd finish what we started, converting it to run on biodiesel. That's when Cynthia made it her personal mission to destroy me. First, it was small things, anonymous complaints about my driveway, about visible mechanical parts that weren't in accordance with her vision of neighborhood perfection. Then she escalated. Environmental violation notices. Threats of legal action. Fines that started at $100, then doubled, then tripled. When that didn't break me, she went further. She staged an environmental disaster right in my backyard. One morning, I woke up to find county inspectors standing on my lawn, pointing at a chemical spill near my biodiesel processing system. They had received an anonymous tip, they said, about contamination. I knew damn well that I hadn't spilled anything, but the evidence was there, clear as day. Because she put it there. She had hired AquaGuard Environmental, a so-called remediation company, that just so happened to be owned by her husband's business partners, to dump industrial contaminants near my property overnight. The next morning, she called the county health department, reporting my biodiesel project as an environmental hazard. The inspectors shut me down immediately. I spent thousands of dollars fighting to clear my name, proving that the contamination hadn't come from me. By the time the truth came out, the damage was done. Cynthia had successfully planted the idea in the minds of my neighbors that I was reckless, that I was some amateur chemist endangering the town's water supply. And while I was spending every last cent trying to fight her fabricated charges, she was stealing from all of us. She had implemented mandatory environmental fees under the guise of protecting the aquifer, forcing homeowners to pay an extra $50 per month, fees that, as I later discovered, were being funneled into her personal accounts through a fake charity called the Pine Crest Sustainability Fund. And where was that money actually going? Luxury spa weekends. Personal renovations. A private membership to a country club. It should have been a scandal, but Cynthia knew how to cover her tracks. She controlled the board, controlled the HOA's finances, and anyone who questioned her was punished. Like Maggie Lawson, the retired environmental science teacher across the street. When she ran independent tests on the neighborhood's water supply and discovered that the real contamination was coming from the estate section's overuse of fertilizers, she spoke up at a community meeting. Cynthia's response? She sent inspectors to her house the next day. Suddenly, Maggie's perfectly legal solar panels were against code. Her rain barrels violated community aesthetic standards. She was fined thousands of dollars in the span of a month. And then there was Walt Thompson, the retired veteran who had lived in Pine Crest Gardens for over 40 years. He was forced out of his home when Cynthia foreclosed on his property over unpaid HOA fines, fines that had started as a few $100s for minor violations but had snowballed into over $15,000. He lost his home. She sold it to a developer. And when a neighbor confronted her about it at an HOA meeting, Cynthia had just smiled and said, "If you can't afford to live here, maybe it's time to move on." That was who she was. That was what she did. And for 7 years, she got away with it. But today? Today was the last day she would ever get to burn someone's life to the ground and walk away unscathed. Because as the sirens wailed louder, and her men inched toward their unmarked van, trying to escape before the cops arrived, Cynthia finally saw what I was holding in my hand. The gold badge. The legal authority that made all of her rules meaningless. And for the first time in her life, Cynthia Blackwell had no control over what happened next. Cynthia's face was frozen in a tight, unreadable mask, but I could see it, the first flickers of panic behind her eyes. Her whole life had been about control, about weaponizing bureaucracy, about twisting rules until they became a noose around the necks of people like me, like Maggie, like Walt. But this time, she had miscalculated. This time, she hadn't just destroyed property, she had committed arson, fraud, and conspiracy right in front of an entire neighborhood armed with smartphones and more than a decade of resentment. Yet, even now, I could see her mind racing, trying to twist reality into something she could control. "This is still a violation of HOA policy," she insisted, voice strained but steady. "Your truck was a hazard. The bylaws clearly state. Bite your tongue before you choke on it, Cynthia." I took a slow step forward, the heat from the still smoldering truck warming my back. "I don't give a damn what your bylaws say. I'm not answering to your board. You're answering to me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The people who had once been too afraid to speak out were seeing what I was seeing, that Cynthia Blackwell wasn't the untouchable tyrant she pretended to be. And that's when Maggie stepped forward. "You want to talk about violations, Cynthia," she said, voice carrying over the quiet murmurs. "How about the mandatory environmental fees you've been collecting? You said they were for water conservation efforts, but we all know where that money really went." Cynthia's jaw tensed, but Maggie wasn't done. She pulled out a folder, flipping it open to printed bank statements, numbers highlighted in red. "I pulled the HOA financial records from last quarter," she continued. "And what do we have here? Tens of thousands of dollars transferred to a little organization called the Pine Crest Sustainability Fund. And where did that money go?" Maggie's gray eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she tilted the folder toward the crowd. "Luxury spa retreats. Renovations to your husband's rental properties. A country club membership." A gasp swept through the onlookers. "Fake charity," someone muttered. "She stole from all of us. She bled us dry." Cynthia's mouth twisted into something between a smirk and a sneer, her usual mask slipping. "That money was earmarked for community upkeep," she said, her voice sharp. "Running a neighborhood at this level requires." "You mean running your lifestyle at this level?" I cut in. "Because it sure as hell wasn't spent on the people paying those fees." More voices now. Louder. Bolder. "Walt Thompson lost his home because of those damn fines. What about the senior couple on Chestnut Drive? They had to sell because of the water bills she jacked up." Cynthia was losing control of the narrative, and she knew it. She turned back toward me, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. "This is nothing more than a baseless attack. You've been a thorn in this community's side for years, Carter. You and your hobby project." She gestured toward the wreckage of the truck, now a twisted, smoking shell. "All of this could have been avoided if you had just followed the rules like everyone else." And there it was. That final note of arrogance. The belief that we were the problem, not her. I took another step forward, voice lowering to something colder, sharper. You want to talk about rules, Cynthia? I nodded toward the two men in hazmat suits, now being questioned by police officers. How about the part where you hired criminals to pour gasoline on my property and set it on fire? That was it. That was the breaking point. The crowd erupted, voices overlapping in a storm of outrage and disbelief. She set the fire on purpose? She could have killed someone. What if it had spread to the houses? Even some of her staunchest supporters, the estate section residents who had once backed her blindly, were looking at her with a different kind of hesitation now. I pressed the advantage. You pretended to be a defender of water conservation while you sold our aquifer to your husband's private bottling company. You evicted a veteran from his home while using HOA funds to remodel your personal vacation property. You staged an environmental disaster to take me down, and when that didn't work, you committed arson. I took a final step forward, standing inches from her now, my voice so low only she could hear it. And you did it all thinking you were untouchable. Cynthia's breath hitched. She wasn't untouchable anymore. Not after this. Not after what was coming next. The wail of sirens grew louder, their piercing echoes bouncing off the houses, shaking the morning stillness that had been ripped apart by fire, betrayal, and the long-overdue reckoning of a woman who had ruled through fear for far too long. Cynthia's face had paled to an ashen gray, her carefully constructed mask cracking at the edges as reality finally closed in around her. The two men in hazmat suits were already being separated by the police, their initial arrogance dissolving into frantic denials as officers questioned them. One of them, the one who had poured the gasoline, kept darting his gaze toward Cynthia like a man waiting for orders that weren't coming. Because Cynthia wasn't in control anymore. I didn't move as Detective Tom Wilkins stepped through the growing crowd, his sharp gaze scanning the destruction before settling on me. He didn't bother with pleasantries. What the hell happened here? I turned slightly, letting him take in the wreckage of my father's truck, the charred pavement where flames had licked hungrily at the asphalt, the two hired men standing stiff and sweating under the weight of their own guilt. And then, finally, I let his gaze land on Cynthia Blackwell, who still held her clipboard like it could protect her from what was about to happen. This, I said slowly, was an intentional act of arson. Wilkins didn't blink, his cop instincts kicking in. You're telling me he pointed at the two men, deliberately set this fire? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned back to Cynthia. Tell him, I said, watching her carefully. Tell him what you told me. That this was neutralization of an environmental hazard. That it was authorized corrective action. Go ahead, Cynthia. Explain. The way her lips pressed together, the way her knuckles whitened around her clipboard, the way her eyes flickered with something that might have been fear, it was all the answer Wilkins needed. He exhaled sharply and turned to his officers. Detain those two, he said, nodding at the men in hazmat suits. We'll sort out who gave the order soon enough. Cynthia snapped out of her silence. You have no right. Wilkins turned on her like a hammer swinging toward glass. I have every right, he said, voice cutting through her protest like a knife. Arson is a felony, Ms. Blackwell. I don't give a damn what authority you think you have under your HOA bylaws, you set fire to a man's property. You endangered homes. Hell, you endangered an entire neighborhood. She steeled herself, lifting her chin, her courtroom instincts taking over. I didn't light the fire myself, she said, voice measured, calm, like she could still talk her way out of this. You can't prove that I directly ordered it. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Oh, Cynthia, I murmured, shaking my head. You've spent so long controlling people that you forgot this isn't one of your HOA meetings. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The crowd pressed in closer, curiosity giving way to sharp anticipation. See, the thing about you, Cynthia? I said, tilting the screen so she could see it. You never shut up when you think you're winning. Then, I hit play. Her voice crackled to life, clear as day, captured in Maggie's recording from earlier that morning. "We neutralized an environmental hazard. Your illegal fuel operation posed a risk to the community water supply. The board authorized immediate action under Emergency Bylaw 8.3. I didn't need to say another word. Cynthia's lips parted, but this time, no excuses came. Wilkins turned back to his officers. "Cuff her." The moment Cynthia Blackwell was forced to turn around, her arms pulled behind her as metal restraints clicked into place, a sound I would replay in my head for years to come. The neighborhood erupted into something I had never heard before. Cheering. The people who had once feared her, who had once cowered under her endless fines and threats, were cheering as she was led away. As she passed me, her fury finally boiled over. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice low, venomous. I let her words roll off me like smoke from the dying fire behind us. "No, Cynthia," I said, voice calm. "For the first time in your life, you will." And with that, Cynthia Blackwell, queen of the HOA, was gone. The fallout from Cynthia Blackwell's arrest spread through Pinecrest faster than the fire she had started. Within hours, news vans lined the streets, cameras capturing the remnants of my father's truck, the blackened driveway, the stunned but satisfied faces of neighbors who had lived under her rule for too long. The footage of her being led away in handcuffs went viral, racking up millions of views overnight. The public outrage was immediate and relentless. Local talk radio hosts debated the unchecked power of HOAs, national networks dissected the implications of a woman who had weaponized bureaucracy and environmental laws to destroy lives for profit. But the real reckoning came when the financial audits began. The Pinecrest HOA was dissolved within a week. Without Cynthia at the helm, the board members she had handpicked either resigned or turned on each other, desperate to avoid legal repercussions. The so-called environmental fees she had been collecting funneled into personal expenses, real estate investments, and private accounts. Her husband's secret Pristine Waters LLC scheme to bottle and sell the town's aquifer? Dead in the water, literally. The court ruled that all assets tied to the fraudulent operation would be seized and reinvested into actual water conservation efforts. As for Cynthia, she pled guilty to felony arson, criminal mischief, and conspiracy to commit fraud. In exchange for a lighter sentence, she surrendered all financial claims to Pinecrest, paid full restitution for damages, and agreed to serve her sentence under house arrest. The final poetic justice? Her mansion was repurposed into a public water conservation center, a facility dedicated to teaching sustainable practices, the very thing she had fought against. She would spend the next 5 years confined to the very home she once ruled over, forced to watch the neighborhood thrive without her. But the real victory came months later, when a flatbed truck rolled into my driveway, carrying something I never thought I'd see again. A 1986 Ford F-150. Identical in every detail to my father's, except this one wasn't just biodiesel. It was fully electric, powered by a revolutionary hybrid system developed by environmental engineers who had followed my story. It had been rebuilt from the ground up, integrating my father's original biodiesel plans with cutting-edge clean energy technology. Inside the glove compartment, a handwritten note from Dr. Henry Wallace, the lead engineer. "Your father saw the future before the rest of the world did. Now, his vision lives on. Take care of her, Jim." As I ran my fingers over the polished hood, I felt it, not just the truck, not just the victory, but my father's presence. The future he had fought for wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for its moment to rise from the ashes. And now, the people of Pinecrest had something even more valuable than justice. They had their power back. What about you? Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA or a Karen on a power trip? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.